Hey everyone, welcome back to another Prism Caribbean video, and today we'll be going through a little bit more detail into the topic of statistics. Today we'll be looking at class intervals, class limits, maybe one or two work examples into what it is exactly, and we'll be going over some formulae, some essential formulae that is for this topic. Right? So first thing, class interval. Right. So for a class interval, right, this is a grouping of statistical data, right? Which can be like 35 to 39 kilograms in a class. So grouping of statistical data. Example, like a class of 35 to 39 kilograms, right? This is a class. Why it is a class? Because it is a grouping of statistical data, right? And an advantage of this is that the data can be interpreted right, I think I spelled that wrong there. Interpreted easier, right? Class limits, right? This identifies like the end value of a class, right? Two types. So you have the lower class limit, lower, and then you have the upper, right? So for example, for a class of 35 to 39 kilograms, the lower class limit will be 35 kilograms, and the upper class limit in this case will be 39 kilograms, right? So we know a class is a grouping of the statistical data, which in this case is like this, right? And from this we can get the limits. We can get a lower limit, and we can get the upper limit, and that's it pretty much for that, right? I'm going to go through now class boundaries, right? So for class boundaries now, we have to note that we are dealing with the decimal 0.5, or I should just write in this case 0.5. Right? So, for example, the lower bound, let's say for example, we have a class interval of 35 to 39 kilograms, right? The upper class boundary, right? And then we will have the lower class boundary, of course. So for this, of course I said we're dealing with 0.5. Of course it can be either 0.5 more or 0.5 less. We're dealing with the upper class first, right? 0.5 more will be 39.5 kilograms. The lower class boundary will be 0.5 less. If we're dealing with the lower class boundary, we are dealing with the lower class boundary minus 0.5, right? And for the upper class boundary, we are dealing with the upper limit plus 0.5, which is what I had here, right? So for the lower class boundary, it will be 35 minus 0.5, which will be 34.5 kilograms, right? So yeah, that's pretty much it for that. Let me go over that one more time. For class boundaries, we are dealing with limits and extent, but we are dealing with the decimal 0.5 as well. So for the upper class boundary, we take the upper limit and add 0.5. Simple. For the lower class boundary, we take the upper limit and the lower limit for the lower class boundary and subtract 0.5, right? And that's it pretty much for that. Right? So now we want to deal with the boundary between two classes, right? So the formula for this is equal to, well, I should put it next to it, right? So the boundary between two classes is equal to the upper class limit plus the lower class limit all over 2. That's it. So we look at the class limit for the boundary between two classes, right? And we add the upper class limit plus the lower class limit, and then we divide it by 2. So now for the midpoint. The midpoint is equal to the upper class boundary plus the lower class boundary divided by 2. Yep, that's it. Of course, these formulae that I'm giving here, they are quite essential to learn, right? So now for the width of a class. Sometimes they may ask you in the examination to find the width of a class, and this will be equal to the upper class boundary minus the lower class boundary, right? So that is all you need to know for that, right? And if I may need to add, I did miss this out in the last video, right? But before I get into the recap, right, the boundary between two classes which I have here, it's simply taking the upper class limit and the lower class limit and dividing it by 2. We add in both, and then dividing it by 2. For the midpoint, on the other hand, we are taking the upper class boundary and the lower class boundary, we are adding it both together and dividing it by 2. As for the width of the class, on the other hand, we are taking the upper class boundary and subtracting it with the lower class boundary, right? And just to recap on something I missed in the last video was the graph for the frequency polygon, right? I thought this was quite important to add because I did see it in a past paper. The frequency goes on the y-axis and the class midpoint goes on the x-axis, right? And that's it pretty much. I look forward to seeing you in the next video to come. Take care.